Okay, that's a pretty decent answer. 11 o'clock. And what exact, so that gives them an axiological orientation of what? If they're at 11 o'clock.
Whole more than intro.
There you go. Actually, I wanted to move it over here because I want to try to use some more of the board. Remember, I started out my comments today by pointing out that these guys are ciphers. C-Y-P-H-E-R-S. Enigmatic symbols of some type of belief system, some type of rational understanding of our duties to the natural world, or of the moral dimensions of our relationship with non-human objects. Anyway, so these guys are ciphers, and just like Leopold is a cipher, he waves his hands at the idea of biotic rights rights in biotic communities per se, right? That's the word that Stone uses, per se. We need to think of the rights of non-human entities as superseding the rights, per se, superseding some of the rights of human beings. Anyway, let me throw out to you guys, all right? So the first answer is that he's up here. When you say 11 o'clock, remember we've got the ciphers all belong in here, okay? They belong left or higher degree than the group A conservationists. So this is where these are the group Bs, okay? And our ciphers are all in through here somewhere, right? And lo and behold, the deep ecologists champion people. And here I'm just making empirical observations, because I read this really good essay actually by this environmental philosopher named Bron Taylor, B-R-O-N, Bron Taylor, who's sort of a pragmatist also, who spent a lot of time actually researching and hanging out with self-described deep ecologists in the self-described radical environmentalist communities around the country, around North America. And he did a lot of, even though he's a philosopher, he did this empirical research. He did this empirical study of what do these guys actually think about? How do they flesh out what deep ecology means for them? Okay, and what he found is that most deep ecologists probably belong up here, right? And guess what's up here? Did you mean to say that you would describe them as neo-Kantian ecocentrists?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's very good, Nate, thank you. That's very sophisticated, and that's a logical place to put them, as we'll see. Okay, here are the neo-Kantian ecocentrists. Here are let's give them a little more room, the neo-Humean ecocentrists. Wait a minute now, they actually start way over here, don't they? And we still haven't covered the environmental virtue ethicists. Deep ecologists probably could draw on environmental. So I want to talk about two different approaches to deep ecology. One is the popular cultural, sociological phenomenon, political movement identity that deep ecology has accumulated over the course of the last 45 years. 43 years to be exact. 1973 was when the term first appeared in any literature, and it appeared of course originally in the work of the Norwegian not sure how to characterize what school of philosophy he comes from, but he's a Spinosist. He's heavy duty into metaphysics. He's the youngest full professor appointed at age 27, the youngest in the history of the country of Norway. Anyway, he hung out with all the heavyweights in the British analytic tradition. But he went on and did his own thing, and he was a Spinoza scholar too, above all else. And Spinoza is a 17th century Dutch of Spanish, and his parents emigrated from Spain, so he's of Spanish descent, but he lived and grew up and lived his whole life in Amsterdam. Spinoza, 1632 to 1677. And he happens to be one of the main inspirations for deep ecology through the work of Arne Naas. Okay? So 1632 to 1677. Very interesting figure, this Spinoza. Grew up in the Jewish community. In fact, his family had to flee from Spain, and they ended up in Holland, in Amsterdam, which in those days was the most progressive part of Europe. But they had to flee because there was some religious persecution. I believe involving the Catholics that were persecuting people in Spain and France. So his parents ended up emigrating, but they were Jewish, which is why they were being persecuted, and they had to go to Amsterdam. And there was a thriving little community, a Jewish community in Amsterdam in those days. But at the age of 22, Spinoza was excommunicated from that community. His birth name was Baruch, which I believe means blessed in Hebrew. And when he was excommunicated, he was above the fray. He was above the fray, and he responded by he had already severed ties emotionally and spiritually and intellectually, certainly, with the church, with the synagogue, with his religious community. So when they excommunicated him, it wasn't that big of a deal to him. But then he changed his name to Benedict, which is the Latin that means the same thing. Benedict means blessing in Latin, and Baruch means blessing or blessed in Hebrew. But anyway, very interesting figure. Politically very, very progressive, quite radical actually. Survived an assassination attempt, was deeply involved in some political intrigues as a young man. And that's largely, I think, politically, and also his thinking was so far advanced beyond the synagogue that they just couldn't handle it. His interpretation of God was not at all consistent with what they were teaching. And so it's very, very unusual. You might think, oh, he was excommunicated. People get excommunicated. Actually, it's very, very rare. In the whole history of Judaism, there are very, very few examples of people being excommunicated. But he's one of them, probably the most famous one. They read the oath of imprecation. They invited him, but he said, nah, I'll sit this one out. And so they read the oath of imprecation in his absence. And they had these candles suspended above this tub of blood, of pig's blood. And when the oath of imprecation was finished, the oath of imprecation was stuff like, let no man read his book, let no man acknowledge him on the street, let no man speak of his philosophy, blah, 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 blah. He ceases to exist, right? Anyway, and then at the end of, when the oath was done being read, the candles, they were lowered into the vat of blood, and then everything went dark, and they all filed out. And he was just, okay, and he went on, he was very young. Yeah, I think he was only 22 or 23 when all that went down. But obviously was very influential in his life. And he was a free thinker, a notorious free thinker. And considered one of the wisest of philosophers. Among the philosophers, right? Can be counted Spinoza, probably Hume and Nietzsche. These people are just operating at this level that's different than culture, anyway. Very wise. But anyway, these guys, all right, and E.O. Wilson, too, of course, is often not, he's, remember we got Norton here, and then I think Norton belongs here, and then I think probably Wilson belongs here, and then we start getting into Collicutt, right, and the Neo-Humeans. And I'm not sure if the deep ecologists will have much sympathy with I don't know. They all admire Aldo Leopold, and you should be grateful to have done all the work that we've done so far, right? If we had just tried to plunge into deep ecology, we would have really struggled, because all the work that we have done to this point, metaethically, we would have had to do all in a different way, but we would have had to do all that work, too. And so that's why in the past I've made a choice. I'm either going to do deep ecology, or I'm going to do this other line of metaethical thinking that comes out of Leopold, right? And which in many ways is more fruitful and is more advanced. I mean, by the time 1973 comes around, actually, they hadn't done a lot of this work yet, but Leopold had published in 1948 or 49, right? With an idea. By the way, what does the distinction between shallow and deep ecology remind you of? Ding, 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 big time. What does it remind you of?
The group A and the group B.
The A-B cleavage, right? Very good. What's your name?
Joy.
Joy. The A-B cleavage. Elizabeth is your given name.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Doesn't it remind you of the A-B cleavage? And this was being written in the mid-1940s, right? From a very different perspective, but much of the work that we think begins fresh with deep ecology begins really much earlier with Aldo Leopold. So my point, though, is that as our other ciphers can easily be interpreted the deep ecologist belongs somewhere between the group B conservation, probably, I would actually say it's very difficult to call them group B conservationists of any kind, and it's very difficult to call them any kind of Norton. For one thing, Norton's come out strongly against deep ecology, and deep ecologists, self-described, people who pay attention to these things have already noticed and have already separated themselves quite dramatically. So no way a deep ecologist is going to say that Norton is a fair representative of what they're trying to argue, okay? But Wilson's an interesting figure, is what I started to say. His concept of biophilia resonates with deep ecologists at this cultural level, right? So I'm going to start just by trying to characterize them culturally. And basically, deep ecology at a cultural level has been described accurately, I think, as a bricolage. Somebody might want to look that word up and make sure I'm using it correctly. But I ripped it off so it should be correct. I should look it up real quick, huh? Okay. A bricolage of all kinds of different competing philosophies. There's all kinds of New Age stuff, both in offshoots of social ecology and in offshoots, more especially in offshoots of deep ecology. You will find self-described people who sympathize with the deep ecology tradition. We'll find many of them are into some kind of exotic spiritual practices or New Age kind of mysticism, things like that. And so it's really, and it's been this, it's been around for a long time too, right? I mean, that's one thing about deep ecology that some of the other traditions we've looked at don't have, right? And namely, a continuous 43-year history of a popular political, cultural, economic movement, right? But note, Christopher Stone publishes his essay in 1972, I think, or 71. And then in 1973, the Norwegian philosopher Arne Naess publishes his essay that I asked you to read for today, the real short one called The Shallow and the Deep Long-Range Ecology Movement. And so it starts out as a political movement almost right off the bat, right? Although it's initiated by a self-described, an academic philosopher, right? Who happens to get into environmental philosophy because of his interest in outdoor recreation. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? But he's a national hero. By the way, Arne Naess is a national hero. His whole family, the Naess family name, is almost treated like royalty in Norway because many of them are mountain climbers, famous mountain climbers, who have gained notoriety. I think for a while Arne Naess held the record for the highest mountain ever. This was in, I think, the late 1940s. Anyway, bricolage. So I threw out that word because construction as of a sculpture or a structure of ideas achieved by using whatever comes to hand. I should, whoop, I don't want that, sorry. Gotta get rid of that. That's a nice song though. Anyway, and I think of ad hoc, right? I think of the word ad hoc. So anyway, keep in mind, this is where we're going to try to pin these guys down. But guess what? There's one more thing I want to share before we move on from this, from what I have on the board here. Guess what? There is a very, very plausible and totally fair, and one that deep ecologists with themselves embrace, interpretation of deep ecology as belonging right in here. Okay? Guess what? With the man, with Schweitzer, right? And Schweitzer and the biocentrists. Deep ecology, jumping ahead, and I might not even get there by the end of today's lecture, but jumping ahead, deep ecology, it has this strange, tensely interrelated axiological orientation, which is this bizarre, perhaps not bizarre, but seemingly strange combination effort to reconcile biocentric egalitarianism, which is what Schweitzer talked about, right? That's what Schweitzer taught us about, biocentric egalitarianism, right? Every living organism is a teleological center of life. And that fact alone, that is a value fact that confers that, it is striving for something, and that striving for something in itself confers moral status upon it, right? And furthermore, it's just moral status. And the deep ecologists Some of them, okay, there's a split on this question, but many deep ecologists simply, and Noss was one of them, simply refuse to try to draw evaluative distinctions between different kinds of moral status, okay? He just says if you have it, and biocentric means life-centered. If you're alive, then you have it, right? And you have it in equal amounts as every other living thing, okay? Noss, of course, wisely has to add the qualifier in principle, right? I've used the term prima facie, right? On the face of it, we have duties to acknowledge, to recognize moral status in all living things, right? In principle, on the face of it, prima facie. Conflicts arise that Noss recognized, but anyway, but then he also wants to, deep ecologists also want to, at a philosophical level, at a cultural level, they're not, a lot of these, they're just going to go with, it's a bricolage, ad hoc, throwing things together, which, by the way, is the same thing like, what a lot of anthros do when it comes to, for example, a question like, should we develop the Tesoro Savage oil terminal at the Port of Vancouver? Remember, I briefly went over a few different kinds of arguments you could put together from a few of these different traditions, right? Grab a little from utilitarianism, especially an economically slanted version of utilitarianism, right? Grab a little from humanism, right? Humans are number one, etc. Grab a little maybe from the wise users. And you've got your justification for Tesoro Savage oil terminal, right? But that too is kind of a bricolage, right? Those arguments, you just kind of grab with whatever works, right? You know what I mean? We're way beyond that now because we've gone through all this meta-ethical work, right? And now we're looking at different examples of systematic, cohesive theories, right? That aren't just bricolages or ad hoc constructions thrown together to try to convince people, okay? You see that tendency, though, both among radical environmentalists to just grab whatever works, right? And then they end up kind of confused philosophically about where they actually stand, or they're not even familiar with the kind of range of positions they might occupy, right? And you see the same phenomenon over here, right? Where just arguments are just kind of, and obviously we're beyond that. We're in a philosophy class. If there's one thing that philosophers can contribute to natural resource management or to any other kind of moral struggle, is its organization, right? We are good at recognizing, breaking down different arguments, right? And recognizing them and identifying them, and holding in suspense whether or not they're going to work for us, right? Because as philosophers, we have to, right? We have to be charitable to every one of these points of view. Anyway, all right. So they could belong here. They could belong. This is the most logical, and if you ask your average deep ecologist on the street, right? Go to the latest bioregional, I've mentioned that a couple times, I'll get into that too. But bioregionalism is sort of a political philosophy that has been lumped together, especially among North America, actually around the world in Europe too. But what's interesting is that bioregionalism, the philosophy of bioregionalism, more clearly comes out of sort of a holistic anthro perspective, right? It's a social justice tradition. And that's very different, right? The bioregional, this is a social justice tradition, and this is just a meta-ethics point of view that a lot of deep ecologists want to cling to, but then when it comes to political practice, they want to embrace bioregionalism. Anyway, but I think that Nate's initial insight, which I was hoping that would be a resounding, echoing cries of absolutely, they belong as neo-Kantians, ecocentrists. Probably a lot more people besides just Nate, would be inclined to put them there. But there's also something appealing about biophilia to the deep ecologist, I think. Right? They might be drawing from some of that. Remember, biophilia deepens the meaning of what it is to be healthy, right? Health is a moral norm. It's always a moral norm, right? And all kinds of environmental ethicists and not even environmental ethicists appeal to the idea of health, right? Health as a moral norm. But once we start talking about, once we include biophilia in our definition of what it means to be a healthy human being, then all of a sudden we realize that, that our concerns kind of, kind of seep out into the non-human world, into the more than human world, right? And so Wilson almost invites us to begin including non-human ecological wholes, right? Wilson almost invites us to include ecological wholes, but only indirectly, right? Because ecological wholes are necessary for species survival, and what we really should be about is saving species for these biophilic reasons, right? Which deepen. So anyway, I can see a deep ecologist finding that to be an attractive theory, too. So Wilson has something to contribute to the deep ecologists, I'm not sure about Collicutt. I think deep ecology could also be described as an environmental virtue ethic, but we haven't gotten there yet, so. Anyway, but at a cultural level, okay, let me digress a little bit. I actually hung out with a lot of self-described. In the 90s, I lived in Eugene when I was going to graduate school, and I had some friends that I'd go river rafting with, and backpacking and skiing and stuff like that. And I didn't know it at the time. I mean, I knew that my friend Ralph, was hung out with a lot of Earth Firsters, self-described Earth Firsters, and maybe Environmental Liberation Front, people like that. But I had no idea, what some of these people were up to. But later on, now this is what's kind of interesting, is I went to law school right after I wrote my doctoral thesis in environmental ethics at the U of O, and was writing that from about 1996 to about 2000. I changed my topic. I mean, I changed within the field of environmental ethics. I changed, moved around quite a bit. It took me a while to write my dissertation, but anyway, this whole time I was, periodically hanging out with some of these people, and later on I found out that they were, some of them had been arrested in this Green Scare campaign by the FBI. They had been rounded up. And they had been involved in these very radical activities. They had been involved in dramatic, very destructive, very expensive property destruction. Burning arson, basically, or burning all these people's property down as a way of protesting what they viewed to be rapacious and, morally wrong, deeply morally wrong policy against our forests and our natural resources and our wildlife, right? So they were doing things like, they set free some wild horses, and they burned down a wild horse, a rendering plant, I think a couple of them. And then they also burned down a lumber mill near Roseburg, I believe, in the Umpqua Valley, that was still processing old-growth trees. One of the few left, maybe the only one left in the Northwest that was still processing these massive old-growth trees. So they targeted those guys. Anyway, and the most famous, I think one of the most famous things they did was they burned down these condominium, the beginning of a big condominium project near Vail. Anyway, and it was going to damage all these, a lot. It was just going to cause a lot of harm. So anyway, so they took matters into their own hands, right, is one way of viewing what they did.
Also a ranger station, too?
Yes, the ranger station in Oak Ridge. But what was going on, was there was one guy, and his name was, and he's the only guy whose name I'm going to mention, right? Jake Ferguson was an informant. It turned out because he was a heroin addict. And he was the only firebug, too, though. He was the only one among the group. And there was about 20 of them, They were loosely knit. They didn't all really know each other, and they were in various different parts of the country. But anyway, but he was the only one among the whole group that had any interest at all in burning things down, right? The rest of them just viewed that as a necessary evil to make their political statement and to try to stop what they viewed as a war against Mother Earth, right? But he was the only one who had some kind of psychological serious problems and issues, and he also happened to be a drug addict, and he ended up getting ensnared because of his addiction into some police investigations, and the next thing you know, they started tying it all together, because anyway, I don't know exactly how it all went down, but eventually they said, look, we got you, and you're gonna be in jail the rest of your life unless you cooperate with us, and so he did. And he was the only one who was never prosecuted either. I mean, he never went to jail, right? He pleaded out, and he got a really, really favorable treatment, right? Because he turned everyone else in. But and all these people were scattered around the country. This was 3 or 4 years after they had done their last action, right? And they'd all broken up, and they were all like, some of them were going to school, some of them were pursuing their careers, and they all moved on. But he flew around the country and got to meet, and just say, hey, I'm in town, hey, come on, let's get together. And ended up recording, right? He had a wire. And he recorded their statements. And then in one day, the FBI swooped in and just arrested like 20 of them in one day, all around the country. And then they were all put on trial. Well, they weren't put on trial because they all negotiated settlements, right? There was only one trial that came out of all that, and that was that one up in Brianna Waters up in Seattle. Because she adamantly refused, that she absolutely denied that she was ever involved in any of those arsons. But it turns out, well, anyway, but they all pleaded out, right? They all accepted negotiated settlements, and they all got prison terms ranging between about 5 years to 13 years. And the last of them just was released, I think, last year. But what was interesting was that when I got out of law school, right, meanwhile I said, okay, I'm not going to do this environmental philosophy because it's just too abstract. I don't want to, and now I realize, well, it's not really that abstract. This is really what I love doing right here. I'm back to where I should have been the whole time. But I thought I would do environmental law, right? So I went to law school and I did all that. But I graduated, finished law school in 06, right? And then I decided to do the bar exam in 07, the spring of 07. So I had this period of time where, I was kind of hoping to serve an internship or maybe even get paid to help a lawyer. So I sent a letter around introducing myself to a bunch of different criminal defense attorneys. And one of them, whose name I was trying to remember her name this morning, but I couldn't remember her name. Anyway, it turned out she was representing one of those guys that had just been arrested. And they were all going to be, they were all in Eugene because that's the court that had jurisdiction. They were they're in the federal court in Eugene. Anyway, so I ended up getting to work on his sentencing hearing, this guy. And I ended up, working with his mom and trying to put together a video and stuff like that. And just helped his family get their test, and his friends and his character witnesses and stuff like that. But I realized, when I got to meet him, I realized, hey man, I went river rafting with you, like 5 years ago. Him and his girlfriend, the two of the principal, bad characters that had done all this stuff. Anyway, so it was just kind of, and so I was kind of exposed to all of this, and I was always on the fringes of it because while they were doing, these radical statements, I was just trying to understand the philosophical basis of a radical point of view, and I would never have endorsed what they did, although they reflected a certain outlook on nature that I empathize with, and and I think it's accurate to describe them as neo-Kantians. What is the statement, no compromise in defense of Mother Earth, remind you of? Non-consequentialism, okay? Are deep ecologists foot stampers? If they're not foot stampers, that means they've got to be some kind of consequentialist ecocentrist, right? Like Collicutt. Collicutt's kind of this consequentialist ecocentrist combined with, he's just confused. He refuses to either commit himself to consequentialism fully or commit himself to non-consequentialism fully. He tries to straddle the fence there. But yeah, so I think what Nate is onto there when he describes the deep ecologists as neo-Kantian ecocentrists, I think he's capturing and I want to use the word sentiment, but I probably shouldn't, but a deep-seated conviction that it's just in principle morally wrong to harm biotic communities. Okay? And now Noss, deep ecology, and Arne Noss in particular, insists that what he's really interested in is ecological consciousness, not an ecological norm. Okay? Well, let me get into my slides a little bit here. So, keep in mind that philosophically we've identified their axiological orientation as a combination of biocentrism, or you can use the word biocentric egalitarianism, and metaphysical holism, which might be at tension. And that may explain, actually, why deep ecology never really evolved into a full-fledged environmental ethic, because it kind of got stuck in this tension between biocentrism and holism. All right, so let's see what's going on. And that's where we left off on Tuesday. I'm going to stick, the more I study and the more I compare all the different positions that we've been studying with environmental pragmatism. I wasn't really even planning this term to spend a lot of time on environmental pragmatism, but you guys know that's kind of where I'm coming from. And the more I think about it, the more I'm very confident that my natural resource values wheel is a fair account of a fairly comprehensive account of the range of values, and that a human might experience, right? And our goal, right, the environmental pragmatist goal is to ensure that as many moral claims can be satisfied as possible, okay? Now, if we can interpret a species across evolutionary time and an ecosystem as making moral claims, which I think a pragmatist can do, then we have all the resources we need to make a normative argument that to make a cultural criticism, which is what a lot of people like maybe Nate, and that's what the attraction to deep ecology is, that it's offering this heavy-duty cultural criticism, right? With people like Edward Abbey, right? All these people are harsh critics of American consumerist culture, and many people who are drawn toward deep ecology share that outlook, right? But anyway, so
what would it look like if you mapped out these different philosophical point of views and how much those individuals, how much time they spent in nature interacting with it? I think that'd be interesting.
Well, someone like Rolston would say that the more time you spend interacting with nature, the more likely you are to recognize that there is a striving taking place in an ecosystem itself. There's a striving taking place in a species over evolutionary time. There's something being experienced there. Remember, for the pragmatist, if there's nothing being experienced, if there's not an experiencer of some kind, then there can't be a moral claim and there can't be a moral obligation. Now that might slam the door shut for the environmental pragmatist, because how can you think of an ecological whole as making a moral claim? And if it's not making a moral claim, then how can we have a responsibility, an obligation toward it, to protect it or preserve it or incur whatever, right? We can't, if we're committed to this pragmatist, right? But when I redescribe experience, then I can see how it's fair to describe, and Rolston does a good job of explaining how this is the case, right? If you understand evolutionary history, then you understand that a species is adapting and responding over many, many generations, right? It's adapting to its environment. It's responding the same way we respond to our environment, right? So it is a measure of experience over a long period of time, right? And that's why an environmental pragmatist can include ecological wholes in his, right? And ultimately the goal now, and the culture we should be striving for, right? Which is what you hope an environmental ethic can give you, and some idea, right? What kind of culture should we be striving for? Well, from an environmental pragmatist point of view, the culture we should be striving for is a culture which secures and makes available as many of these experiences of value as possible, okay?